You know that moment. Your email dings late, that deadline whooshes past, or maybe you blurt out something you wish you could instantly retract. What's the first thing that pops into your head?
Yeah.
Usually some kind of explanation starts to form.
Right.
It feels more like we're crafting a lifeline, an excuse.
What's fascinating here, and you touched on it, is that this isn't just a quirk of your personality or mine. It's very human. Our source material, AI, explores the nature of human excuses. It looks at this from a really unique standpoint, almost detached.
Like a clinical observation?
Yeah.
Exactly. So we're not here to point fingers or dissect that time you were really late.
Right.
The mission of this deep dive is more about getting under the hood of why. Why do we lean on excuses? This AI analysis we've got looks at what truly defines an excuse, how it differs from a genuine reason or, say, a justification, and fundamentally why we seem almost predisposed to create them.
And if we connect this to a broader understanding of ourselves, we'll be exploring the psychology behind it, the history, how it varies across cultures, and maybe even some potential biological roots. There are some real insights to unpack here.
And for you listening, if you've ever felt that nagging sense that an explanation just wasn't quite cutting it, maybe, or if you're simply curious about this fundamental aspect of being human, this deep dive is definitely for you. We've tried to extract the core findings, give you a clearer picture without getting lost in, overly academic jargon.
So let's start by maybe laying down the basics, establishing our framework. The report highlights that at its core, making excuses often serves as a kind of psychological defense.
A defense, like a way our minds try to shield us. Tell me more about that.
Precisely. It's often about navigating uncomfortable feelings, shame, guilt, the discomfort of blame from others, even our own self-reproach sometimes. The source points out, for instance, attributing a setback to being incredibly busy or distracted. Well, that can feel much easier on our ego than admitting, I simply didn't handle that well, or I dropped the ball.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about softening the blow, protecting ourselves.
Indeed. And the benefits aren't just internal. Excuses can help us maintain a sense of control, frame an error as maybe an isolated incident rather than a deep personal failing. And especially if you pair it with an apology, they can help preserve our social standing, how others see us.
So it's not just about avoiding bad feelings inside, it's also managing perceptions, how we look to others.
That's a crucial element, definitely. And the report also touches on something maybe less obvious. Sometimes we use what sound like reasons to rationalize just not doing things. Inaction.
How so?
Well, we might develop explanations to avoid stepping outside our comfort zone, right? And these can easily solidify into actual excuses.
Like saying, oh, I'm just not good with public speaking, to avoid an opportunity that might actually benefit me. I can see that. Now, the report also draws this really important distinction between excuses, reasons, and justifications. This feels key.
It absolutely is. We tend to use these words almost interchangeably in everyday talk, but psychologically they serve different purposes. An excuse, fundamentally, is about trying to evade consequences, deflect blame. It suggests we shouldn't bear full responsibility, often by pointing to, external factors.
Right, like the classic, the train was delayed when maybe, just maybe, I hit snooze one too many times.
Exactly. That's a classic excuse territory. A reason or explanation, on the other hand, generally acknowledges responsibility. It's about clarifying why something happened based on facts with the aim of fostering understanding, not escaping blame.
Okay.
So, there was unexpected major construction on my usual route. I had to detour. That would be more of a reason for being late.
Okay, so a factual count, intended to inform, not necessarily to absolve, and justification. That sounds like it takes it another step, defending the action itself.
It does. A justification attempts to show that the action was actually acceptable, maybe even the right thing to do, given the specific circumstances. For example, maybe you shared confidential information, but it was to prevent someone from coming to serious harm. That would be an attempt at justification.
Got it. So the critical difference really boils down to the intent. Am I trying to get off the hook, clarify the situation, or argue that what I did was actually okay?
Precisely. Intent is key. Now, let's maybe step back and look at the historical picture. This isn't exactly a new phenomenon, this excuse-making. The report goes into that, too.
Right. Humans have been messing up forever, so I guess excuses have been around just as long. What does history tell us?
Well, historically, when someone did wrong, the process often involved admitting fault, seeking forgiveness, and crucially, pledging to do better, to refrain from doing it again. But the report highlights an interesting shift, kind of alongside what it calls the therapeutic mentality.
Therapeutic mentality. What does that mean in this context?
It's this more contemporary tendency to frame behavioral problems less as moral failings requiring repentance and more as conditions needing treatment or intervention. The report suggests that this shift, while often helpful, can sometimes unintentionally sort of diffuse personal accountability.
So it becomes less my fault and more this issue I'm dealing with.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And historically, the report notes that influential leaders often viewed excuses pretty negatively. They emphasized commitment, results. That famous saying comes to mind, difficulty is the excuse history never accepts.
That resonates. Leaders are kind of expected to overcome obstacles, not just explain why they couldn't.
Exactly. And even if you look way back, ancient texts show people rationalizing their failures to follow rules or commands. The report mentions instances in early religious writings, people offering excuses for disobedience. So this tension, between taking responsibility and finding external explanations, it seems like a pretty constant theme.
Okay, so it's deeply human, maybe timeless. But the report also really emphasizes how culture shapes what counts as a valid excuse. That sounds fascinating.
It really is. Cultural norms have this huge influence on the whole landscape of excuses. What might be seen as a perfectly reasonable explanation in one culture could be met with, well, skepticism or even disapproval in another.
Can you give some examples? Because I can already imagine situations where cultural wires could get crossed over explanations.
Sure. The report contrasts polychronic cultures where time is seen as more fluid. Multiple things happen at once with monochronic cultures, where schedules and punctuality are really highly prized. So being late and offering an excuse like, oh, I got caught up in another important conversation, might land very differently in those two contexts. It might be more acceptable in the polychronic one.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's about the prevailing norms, the expectations within that specific cultural setting.
Exactly. And the report also treads into that delicate area of using cultural difference as an explanation for behaviors that, from a wider perspective, might be seen as harmful. Saying, oh, that's just how our culture does things, can sometimes be a way to sidestep responsibility for actions that have negative consequences.
That's a really critical point. Understanding cultural context is vital, absolutely, but it shouldn't become a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for everything. There must be some principles that cut across cultures.
Precisely. And even within a single culture, there can be these unwritten rules, right? Where certain excuses get implicitly accepted, maybe just to avoid offense or keep things smooth socially.
So sometimes we might nod along to a flimsy explanation just to keep the peace. I think we can all relate to that one. Now, how do these cultural differences play out when people from different backgrounds interact?
This is where it can get quite tricky and sometimes lead to real friction. Our assumptions, often subconscious, about what's acceptable behavior and what's a valid explanation can definitely clash.
Like what, for instance?
Well, the report mentions direct versus indirect communication styles. In a culture valuing directness, maybe even bluntness, a more roundabout or vague explanation might come across as evasive, like an excuse. But in a culture that prioritizes politeness, saving face, maybe a more nuanced justification is preferred over a stark admission of fault.
So even how we deliver the explanation is culturally shaped. And attitudes towards time, like you mentioned earlier, that's a big one too.
Absolutely. And there's a real danger, the report highlights this, of using culture almost as a smokescreen, to justify practices that aren't helpful or are even harmful, which actually hinders real cross-cultural understanding.
Yeah.
It's about trying to figure out when a cultural explanation reflects genuine differences in norms and when it's maybe just a convenient way to dodge accountability.
Okay, so we've looked at the psychological drivers, the cultural layers. Now let's bring it closer to home. How does this whole excuse-making habit affect us as individuals and in our relationships?
The impact on the individual can be pretty profound, actually. The report suggests that habitual excuse-making can function as a kind of self-handicapping.
Self-handicapping. What does that involve?
It's when we sort of provide reasons for potential failure before an event even happens. Like, oh, I didn't get much sleep, so I probably won't do well in this presentation. This can subconsciously lower our actual effort and expectations, almost setting the stage for the very failure we were trying to explain away. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow, that's fascinating. Kind of paradoxical. So by trying to shield ourselves from the sting of failure, we might actually make it more likely.
Exactly. And while an excuse might give you that temporary ego boost or reduce anxiety in the moment, the long-term effects can be pretty detrimental. The report really emphasizes that consistent excuse-making undermines personal accountability. It hinders growth. It can even lead to feelings of helplessness or low self-confidence over time.
Because if we never truly own our mistakes, we miss the chance to learn from them, to feel like we have some control over our lives.
Precisely. Avoiding responsibility means losing those crucial learning moments, and it can weaken our motivation to do better next time. Now, shifting to relationship, excuses can be particularly corrosive there.
Oh, I can imagine, especially if it's about broken promises or, selfish behavior.
Absolutely. The report underscores that excuses in these situations really erode trust. They prevent genuine resolution. When someone consistently resorts to excuses, it can make the other person feel unheard, invalidated, like their feelings just don't matter as much as the need to avoid blame.
It's kind of like saying, my comfort in avoiding blame is more important than your pain or disappointment.
Exactly. Prioritizing taking responsibility over making excuses is just fundamental for building and maintaining trust, for fostering open communication. And the report makes a strong point about romantic relationships. A consistent pattern of making excuses for bad behavior. That's a major barrier to mutual respect.
Absolutely. You can't build a healthy relationship on a foundation of deflected blame. But the report also mentions empathy. How does empathy fit in here? It seems important.
Empathy, understanding, and sharing someone's feelings is vital, yes, but the report draws a line. Empathy is different from accepting excuses for harmful actions. You can understand the factors, maybe the pressures that led someone to act a certain way, but that doesn't mean you have to accept their excuse as a justification for the harm caused.
So understanding the why is important for compassion, maybe forgiveness down the line, but it doesn't automatically excuse the behavior itself. That's a crucial distinction. Okay, let's move into the ethical territory now. How does our tendency to make excuses stack up from a moral perspective?
Ethically, relying on excuses raises big questions about responsibility and accountability. In professional settings, for example, a persistent pattern of making excuses is usually seen as dodging duty. It can seriously undermine trust within a team or an entire organization.
Yeah, if you can't rely on colleagues to own up when things go wrong, it creates a really toxic or at least dysfunctional environment.
Absolutely. And the report points to a concerning link between excuse-making and something psychologists call moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement. That sounds pretty serious.
It refers to these cognitive tricks, basically, that let us act against our own moral standards without feeling the usual guilt or shame. Making excuses is a key part of this. It allows us to rationalize our actions, maintain a positive self-image, even when our behavior might be ethically questionable if we looked at it objectively.
So it's like our brain doing mental gymnastics to avoid facing the uncomfortable ethical truth of our actions.
Precisely. This can involve using softer language euphemisms for harmful acts, maybe blaming the victim or downplaying how bad the consequences really were. The report also highlights that feelings like shame and guilt, while uncomfortable, are really important guides for ethical behavior. By making excuses, we suppress those feelings, and that can actually hinder our moral learning.
So avoiding the discomfort also means missing out on the lesson. And thinking about leadership, the report stresses accountability over excuses.
Definitely. Ethical leaders take ownership. They own their decisions, the outcomes, good or bad. When a culture of excuses takes root, it can signal a wider breakdown of accountability. Now, the report also touches on distinguishing between excusable and inexcusable behavior, ethically speaking. And this is a really complex area.
I bet. Where do you even begin to draw that line?
Well, intentions often play a big part. If someone acted with genuinely good intentions, but things went wrong due to totally unforeseen circumstances they couldn't control, that excuse might be seen as more acceptable. However, the report stresses, even then, the excuse usually lessens the blame. It doesn't completely remove responsibility.
Right. You might get understanding, but you still have to acknowledge the impact, what happened.
Exactly. And then there are certain things like intentional harm, abuse that are widely considered inexcusable, pretty much regardless of the circumstances or explanations offered. The severity just outweighs any potential excuse.
That makes sense. Some lines just can't be excused away. Now let's dive into the emotional side of this.
Yeah.
How do feelings drive us to make excuses, and what are the emotional consequences?
Emotions are just deeply tangled up with excuse-making. A primary driver often is wanting to avoid anxiety and shame. When we face potential failure or criticism, that first instinct can be to whip up an excuse as a shield for our self-esteem.
Like an emotional flinch reflex, cushioning the blow.
Exactly. And we often craft our excuses, consciously or not, to manage how we think others will react emotionally. Hoping to sidestep their anger or disappointment, maybe get sympathy instead. Interestingly, the report points out that emotions themselves can sometimes be presented as excuses. Think about legal contexts, like a claim of acting under duress.
So being under extreme emotional pressure could be a legitimate factor, legally speaking.
Yes, but that's different from what the report calls emotional reasoning. That's when we build excuses based purely on how we feel about something, even if there's no objective evidence.
Like it's saying, I couldn't possibly focus on that report. I was just feeling so overwhelmed, even if, objectively, I had plenty of time and resources.
That's a perfect example. The report also highlights how specific emotions like shame, guilt, fear, anger all kind of swirl around in this excuse landscape. Shame and guilt are often why we feel the need for an excuse in the first place.
We're trying to dodge those negative self-judgments.
Precisely. And fear of consequences, fear of failure itself, that can also be a powerful motivator for explanations. Then on the receiving end, if someone shoots down our excuse, it can spark anger, especially if we're sensitive to rejection.
It's like a double whammy. Not only did I mess up, but my attempt to smooth it over was rejected too.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember, while understanding the emotional drivers behind behavior is helpful, feeling an emotion doesn't automatically excuse actions that cause harm or fail responsibilities.
Right. Feeling angry might explain why I snapped, but it doesn't make the snapping okay. Now, how does society sort of writ large react to all this excuse-making?
Societal responses are really layered. They vary depending on whether you're looking at individual interactions, group dynamics, or even institutional policies. At the individual level, like we've said, the reaction often depends on the relationship, the context, how sincere the excuse seems. But repeated excuses, they almost always erode trust.
Yeah, that credibility just tanks after a while.
Absolutely. Within groups, teams, communities, if excuse-making becomes common and accepted, it can actually lower the bar for everyone. It can hinder progress. If the focus shifts to justifying why things aren't getting done rather than finding solutions, morale tends to drop.
It creates an atmosphere where just getting by, maybe mediocrity, becomes a norm.
Exactly. And at the institutional level, you have formal rules. Policies that dictate what counts as an acceptable excuse and what the consequences are. Think about excused versus unexcused absences at school or work.
Right, so there are official systems for judging the validity of explanations. Now, the report also mentions the impact of a culture of excuses. That phrase itself sounds pretty negative.
It generally is. When making excuses becomes the default, the norm, the focus shifts away from proactive problem solving and towards just justifying why things went wrong. This can really stifle innovation, creativity, because people become more worried about avoiding blame than taking calculated risks and learning from potential failures.
It breeds a kind of risk aversion where accountability gets fuzzy.
Precisely. And it can lead to lower standards overall because there's less pressure to strive for excellence if accountability is weak. Counteracting that takes a conscious effort. Prioritizing problem solving, learning from mistakes, and that usually needs strong leadership pushing for and modeling accountability.
Okay, so shifting from a culture of justification to one of responsibility. Now let's get philosophical for a bit. How do philosophers tackle this whole excuse business?
Philosophy offers some really useful ways to think about excuses. That classic debate, free will versus determinism, has huge implications for how we view responsibility and whether an excuse is even valid. If our actions are totally predetermined, can we really be held accountable in the same way?
Whoa, that's a big one. If everything's set in stone, are our excuses just acknowledging those predetermined factors?
Some philosophical theories wrestle with that directly. There's the choice theory of excuse, which suggests an excuse holds water if the person genuinely lacked the capacity or the real opportunity to choose differently at that moment. Then there's the character theory, which looks at whether the wrongful action actually reflects the person's stable, enduring character traits, or if it was an anomaly.
So was it a genuine couldn't-do-otherwise situation, or just a blip that isn't really them?
Those are the kinds of nuances these frameworks help us unpack. And the report notes that excuses often modify moral responsibility. They don't usually wipe it clean. We might be seen as partly excused, but not totally off the hook. The whole concept of agency, our ability to act intentionally, is central too. Excuses often pop up when our sense of agency feels weakened or absent.
Okay, so philosophy helps us think critically about the conditions of our actions and our level of control when things go sideways. What about existentialism? They must have a strong take on this.
Oh, you're right. Existentialism, focusing so much on radical freedom and inherent responsibility, tends to be pretty tough on excuses. The core idea is that we create ourselves through our choices. So ultimately, we're responsible for who we are and what we do, kind of regardless of the circumstances.
So blaming external factors is seen as dodging that fundamental responsibility for our own existence, basically.
Exactly. Thinkers like Sartre talked about bad faith essentially denying our freedom, evading responsibility by blaming outside forces, making excuses. That's seen as a classic example of bad faith. It's avoiding the burden, maybe the anxiety that comes with freedom. Existentialism pushes us to embrace that freedom, create meaning through action, and reject excuses as inauthentic.
Wow, no easy outs there. Okay, shifting gears again, let's think biology. Could there be like built-in evolutionary reasons why we're prone to making excuses?
The report explores some potential biological and evolutionary angles, yeah. It suggests a possible link to the brain's fear response system involving the amygdala. When we sense a threat or anticipate something negative, it can trigger that fight or flight response. Psychologically, that might translate into needing to explain or excuse our way out of potential negative social consequences.
So almost like a primitive survival tactic adapted for social situations.
Potentially, yeah. And also, the drive for a sense of control seems pretty fundamental, biologically. When things feel out of our control, we might be more inclined to rationalize outcomes or create excuses just to regain that feeling of agency. The report even mentions the illusion of control, our tendency to overestimate how much influence we have. That might have actually been evolutionarily advantageous, maybe fostering optimism or persistence.
Interesting. So making sense of bad outcomes, even if it's through an excuse, could have helped our ancestors keep going.
Could be. And beyond those basic drives, the report looks at defense mechanisms and cognitive biases.
Ah, the usual suspects. Those mental shortcuts and self-deceptions.
Precisely. Defense mechanisms like denial, rationalization, projection, they all feed into excuse-making. Rationalization is a big one, creating those plausible-sounding justifications without really looking at the true motives. And cognitive biases are huge here, too. The self-serving bias, taking credit for success, blaming external factors for failure. That's basically excuse-making 101. Or the planning fallacy, always underestimating how long things take, leads directly to excuses for delays. Confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, they all play a part.
So it really does seem like our brains are kind of set up in ways that make excuses a pretty natural fallback.
There's definitely a strong case for that. Now let's think about how we actually learn this behavior. How do kids, for instance, get so good at making excuses?
Well, I guess they learn by watching us, right? The adults around them. How we handle mistakes.
Yeah.
How much responsibility we take.
That's absolutely right. Children are like sponges, observing and internalizing how adults make excuses, and maybe just as importantly, how adults accept excuses from others or from the kids themselves. Parents, teachers, caregivers, we can all inadvertently model this. The report also points out how praise and correction matter. Too much praise, for instance, might create fragile egos. That makes it harder for kids to admit mistakes, so they might lean on excuses to protect that praised self-image.
Because admitting fault feels more threatening if your whole sense of self is tied up in being good or smart all the time.
Exactly. And if we overemphasize avoiding failure, we might accidentally teach kids that making an excuse is better than facing negative feelings or consequences. Deflecting blame becomes the perceived safer route.
It sounds like we might not be doing a great job explicitly teaching kids the skills to take responsibility to cope with messing up. Is the report suggesting there's a gap there, maybe in education?
It hints at that, yeah. Educational systems often prioritize academics over developing social-emotional skills like accountability. Plus, adults might just feel uncomfortable confronting a child's defensiveness directly. Cultural norms, too, influence how tolerant we are of certain excuses. And maybe our societal focus on success means we don't spend enough time teaching kids how to navigate mistakes, learn from them, and own them.
So we could be unintentionally raising a generation that's better at explaining away problems than actually fixing them. That's a sobering thought. Now, the report also brings in a really modern, fascinating angle. AI, using artificial intelligence to understand our excuses. How can AI possibly shed light on this very human thing?
Well, AI, especially with natural language processing and machine learning, can sift through huge amounts of text. It can spot linguistic patterns typical of excuse-making, specific phrases, keywords, even grammatical structures that often signal a lack of ownership.
So AI might pick up on an excuse, even if it sounds pretty convincing to a person.
Potentially, yes. And sentiment analysis can try to detect the underlying emotions that might be prompting the excuse. By analyzing communication logs or other data over time, AI could even spot habitual excuse-making patterns in individuals. It might notice subtle cues we humans miss.
Wow, like an objective excusometer. What are some potential uses for that kind of analysis?
The report suggests things like AI chatbots that could help people reflect on their own explanations, maybe suggesting more direct, responsible ways to communicate, offering non-judgmental feedback. You could also imagine personalized AI tools flagging someone's individual patterns just to increase self-awareness, maybe even integrating into platforms like email or chat, offering real-time nudges towards clearer, more accountable language.
That's pretty wild. Imagine your email saying, maybe rephrase that to take more ownership. But analyzing communication like that, there must be ethical flags.
Oh, absolutely. Data privacy is huge. The potential for misuse, manipulation. These are serious concerns as this tech develops. Defining the appropriate role for AI in such, fundamentally human communication needs very careful thought.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, the report goes even deeper, exploring excuses in the context of, well, big existential questions, life, death, meaning. How do excuses fit in there?
From that existentialist perspective we touched on, making excuses for inaction or for not living a fulfilling life, that can be seen as avoiding the weight of our own freedom, avoiding the responsibility to create meaning in a world that doesn't just hand it to us. It's back to that idea of bad faith.
So saying, oh, I never pursued my dream because I didn't have the right breaks, could be seen as an excuse to avoid the anxiety of actually trying and maybe failing, or even succeeding in facing what comes next.
Exactly. In contrast, lots of philosophical or spiritual traditions emphasize engaging with life, taking responsibility for choices as the way to find purpose. That's the opposite of making excuses for not living authentically. Excuses in this bigger picture can become a way to sidestep those fundamental questions about our limited time here and the need to make it count.
Like getting bogged down in the small justifications to avoid facing the really big questions. Now, the report also connects excuses to something really dark. Cruelty and harmful behavior.
Yes, and this loops back to moral disengagement. People who do harmful things often use excuses and justifications to rationalize their behavior. It allows them to inflict harm without fully facing the moral horror of it. This might involve dehumanizing victims, blaming them for what happened, minimizing the consequences, all sorts of cognitive distortions.
So the excuse acts like a shield, silencing their own conscience.
Precisely. A lack of empathy makes it easier to generate excuses for cruelty, too. Some people might even misuse the idea of being authentic as a license to be inconsiderate or hurtful. And sometimes deep-seated self-loathing gets projected outwards, leading to harmful actions that are then rationalized away. Understanding these excuse mechanisms is really crucial if we want to challenge and hopefully reduce harmful behavior.
This has been incredibly thorough, a real deep dive into the world of excuses. So if you had to boil it down, what's the core insight we should walk away with?
I think the fundamental takeaway is that excuse-making is, well, it's complex, it's deeply ingrained, it's multifaceted, and it has real consequences, personally and societally. Understanding where it comes from, the different mechanisms at play, that's really the essential first step towards fostering more accountability, both in ourselves and others, and hopefully having more meaningful, honest interactions.
Absolutely. It really makes you pause and think about that fine line, doesn't it, between a genuine explanation and just deflecting. When are we truly owning our part, and what are we just trying to get out from under it?
And that's maybe the question for each of us to reflect on. That AI analysis mentioned in the report, and it's a fascinating idea, could being more aware of the language patterns of excuses help us communicate more accountably?
That's definitely something to mull over. So for everyone listening, we encourage you to think about your own tendencies, maybe the societal norms you see around excuses. What have you picked up today that might resonate or be useful in your own life, your own interactions? This has really just scratched the surface of understanding this complex, very human aspect of ourselves.
This is DigitView.